Welcome to my presentation for the Tiny House Summit. My name is Saul Hansen, and I got involved with tiny houses when I volunteered to help my local high school with their tiny house program. They built tiny houses as part of their shop class. From there, with a group of other people, I founded the Collaborative Tiny House Project so I could help other schools replicate and implement other tiny house programs. And everything has just kind of gone forward from there. It ended up being a lot larger project than we initially thought, and so just as a result of committing to it, learned a lot of different material. So I'm going to be covering 6 different areas. So I'm going to be covering the philosophy and concepts that we found resonate with the tiny house movement from the project that we did, the different demographics most interested in our project and as well tiny houses in general, and statistics revolving around why tiny houses are such a good idea. And then we're going to move to the lessons learned from the Collaborative Tiny House Project. And from there, that's going to segue into how to navigate legal pitfalls before building a tiny house. And then we're going to go to a conclusion. And so starting off with philosophy and concepts, we delved into why tiny houses appeal to people. We wanted to try to figure that out so that we could cater our marketing to really what resonated with people. And we identified a few core things. Some people see tiny houses as a method of getting a conventional house debt-free, almost like a springboard, as a way to save a lot of money so they can later on put a down payment towards a normal-sized house, while others look at them as a way to avoid a conventional house entirely. For the younger generations, it seems like it was split between these two. Some want to live a minimalist lifestyle indefinitely, while others see tiny houses as a way to save money rather than paying rent living somewhere else, so that they can save more aggressively for a conventional home later. For others, there are many who have had the big house with the white picket fence, and they have kind of been there and done that. And between realizing they don't need that much house and not wanting that much house to keep up on, tiny houses are the perfect solution. We'll get into more of those the different demographics later, like I mentioned earlier. Also, the concept of simplicity is one that resonated a lot with people. In the United States of America, there is a remarkable system in place that caters to demand, based on capitalism and such. Because the house with the white picket fence has been the demand, business in our society has adjusted to be able to provide that for people, and to provide it for anyone. I want to say that I admire the system, and I'm really grateful for it. I am really amazed at everything and all of the perks and hookups that we have in this country. However, this system can and does work against a lot of people. In just for an example, I'm going to get into a couple things. So in our society, we have every type of insurance. There's health insurance, dental insurance, life insurance, car insurance, house insurance, and probably a whole lot of others. And as a result of our society, each one comes with an emotional weight or burden. You know, each one has a little bit of a financial responsibility, and so those add up. And so whether or not someone has them, it still kind of takes its toll. Yeah, regardless of whether or not someone has them, it definitely takes its toll because of the expectation that we should have them. So out of all of these different things, out of all the different costs and things that pile up that we have to cover as members of this society, housing is the greatest expense in anyone's life. It's the single greatest investment that anyone's going to make in their life, and they're really expensive. So between rent or a mortgage, there isn't any one area that costs as much as a house or housing. Businesses everywhere charge whatever the market will bear. Doesn't matter what the market or the industry is. That's just kind of the way that it works. So as a result, housing costs can inflate very rapidly. I was talking with a friend studying to be a real estate developer at Columbia University in New York City, and he said that in general, a good rule to follow in order for anyone to have a high quality of life, that housing should not exceed 30% of their income. And what he said is that in New York and areas of New Jersey and areas like that, where it's densely populated areas, that housing costs are equivalent to 65 to 70% of people's incomes. And so what that does is it locks them into their circumstance. Housing is so expensive that they can't direct anything towards any type of savings or any type of basically setting up a means to improve their circumstance. So it pretty much locks them into a class. And so housing, like expensive housing in those areas, it creates a greater divide in classes as people are putting so much money towards housing that they can't afford anything else. So tiny houses place housing costs easily inside of that 30% income range. Whether you're having one built or whether you're renting, either way, it fits in that range really easily. So even for people working minimum wage jobs, it still fits at that 30% income range, which is pretty remarkable. So for all of the different emotional burdens that come with all the different insurances and hookups that is expected of citizens in our society, tiny houses provide the means to save so much financially that all of those other areas, or most of them, become a non-issue. So by making housing really affordable, it really boosts the quality of life in every other area because there's so much more extra income and extra finances to go, to distribute in different ways. So what is great about tiny houses as well is that the highest level of quality can be attained by anyone. So say, for example, people who have really large houses and very, very lavish houses with incredible finishes, amazing tile, different things like that. What's really incredible about tiny houses is that because they're so small, you can really max out your materials with the finest materials and the finest products and still be able to afford it just fine. When between having counter space and partition walls and different things like that, when there's only 150 square feet of flooring, you can max it out to the most expensive product available. So, and I'll get into more of that a little bit later with some of the experience with the collaborative tiny house. So, tiny houses provide access to the highest quality of living environments for anyone, and this standard of quality is a really important element when it comes to tiny houses. And in my personal opinion, this standard of quality must be perpetuated and preserved in order for the movement to continue moving forward and gaining momentum. And I'll cover a little bit more of that in the conclusion. So going on to demographics, with our budget for advertising that we did with the collaborative tiny house project, we did several different marketing campaigns on Facebook and different social media platforms. And with each one, just because we were kind of experimenting, we would target a different demographic that was very, very specific. And most of all was a very narrow demographic. So we found that by far the greatest interest in tiny houses came from women, and two demographics of women specifically. The first was women between 25 and 35 years old, and the demographic that had the most interest in tiny houses out of them all was single women of the baby boomer generation. So right now in the United States of America, there is already a shortage of caregivers for full-time assisted living situations. In the coming years, all of the baby boomers will retire, and it won't be long till they will be in need of caregivers. When this happens, in just a few years, like this isn't theoretical, like this is coming, 20% of the U.S. population will be over 65 years old. So 1 in 5 people. Assisted living care facilities cost between $55,000 to $85,000 a year. Most low and middle class families will not be able to afford these premiums for any of their family members that are going to be needing full-time care. So up until this point in the world, I would say that the United States and possibly a few other countries that have a lot of similar dynamics, the the tradition has been to be in hot pursuit of your own American dream, and then as soon as you reach retirement age, you either take care of yourself for as long as possible, and then eventually go into a permanent assisted living facility, and your family, instead of taking care of you or helping you out in a full-time situation, they are then in the prime of their lives and are in hot pursuit of their American dream. And so just kind of the culture in our society has just kind of expected that, and it's just kind of built into our society that we don't take care of our elders, and that's a very different concept compared to a lot of other countries. I have a little sister, and she was visiting with someone who was asking about where we lived in our family and such, and this person was from an Asian country, and was a foreigner, and so in explaining that, like, oh yeah, we live out in the country, we grew up on a ranch, and so each one of us lives up there. So my grandma has her house, and then a while over, get further over on the ranch, then there's my uncle and parents. And so this young lady was like kind of shocked. She was appalled, and she's like, wait, she's like, you mean your grandmother lives by herself, all alone? And she was she was horrified. That was the case. She's like, you mean she's all by herself? And she's like, yeah, she has her own place. And the next question that she asked was, well, who takes care of her? And so in every other country in the world, the standard is for elders to move in with their children well before they are in need of full-time care, and they become family members and parts of the family, and then that way family managed care is kind of built in, and these elders help take care of the children, and it's very much of a symbiotic relationship where it's mutually beneficial. And so that's the way that most other countries do it. And so very, very soon, the United States of America will, by necessity, be forced to transition and shift to more of a social model where that's like socially acceptable and where that's common, because there isn't enough money in the country, in the healthcare system as it is, and there's just going to be this flood of people who need full-time care. And so what will happen is we will likely experience a tremendous shift in lifestyles as a society as families transition to family managed care. So not for all, but for many, tiny houses will be a financial solution that enables elderly parents or grandparents to still have their own space but still remain close in proximity so that they can be monitored by family. There was a gentleman who started Healthy Tiny Homes, and he is pretty much on top of this concept. If he were to focus on one demographic, then this would be it. In general, pretty much every product that we enjoy now is a result of the baby boomer generation. Almost every company has catered to the needs of the baby boomer generation as it is, from childhood through adulthood and now into their elderly years. And so he, in observing that, that's kind of where he's at. And so one of the things that he mentioned was that elderly people, they don't really need care very often when they're in their own space, but when they need help, they really, really need help. So say when they've fallen or something like that. And so I have a grandmother who's 84, I think. She might be 85. And I think she'll be 85 in March. Anyway, she has not fallen very often, but when she has fallen, she needs help immediately. And so by having tiny houses, where they can be monitored and different things like that, and anymore, technology is so mainstream where it would be very easily to set up systems in the tiny house to be able to quickly alert a family member if someone elderly in the family has fallen. And so it'd be very, very easy to set things like that up. And so tiny houses will probably be a very viable solution to serve that need of family managed care, which is coming. So I'm going to share the following demographics that we found through our marketing campaigns, through our ad campaigns, that might benefit from tiny houses. So the baby boomer generation in general, single male baby boomers, single female baby boomers, mother-in-laws, elderly parents and grandparents under family managed care, retired veterans, young veterans recently out of the military, and also single active duty military personnel. A lot of times, they're here and then they're gone, and so having a place that they can either take with them to their new orders or stay in when they return home before they go out on another tour. It seems like especially relevant. And then bachelors and bachelorettes, college students, and special needs, adults with autism and Down syndrome. I'll get into that demographic a little bit later. And then young couples, like young couples without children. And then small families, depending on the size of the tiny house. And then the homeless population. And then also tiny houses can serve for replacement boarding houses. I'll just explain that really quick, as I haven't written much of it later. In kind of delving into this, I think it was in the mid-90s, somewhere around 1996, where the majority of all boarding houses throughout the country were closed. And so generally single men who worked either full-time or part-time jobs but didn't have families, they would work and then they would live in these boarding houses where basically there's like a shared kitchen and a shared public restroom, and then each one of them had their own individual rooms with simply a bed, maybe a TV, very, very simple, and almost set up like a hostel. And so for whatever reason, these boarding houses were closed, and so a lot of these gentlemen who depended on boarding houses and where that had just been their lifestyle, as soon as that was removed, there was not an affordable replacement and has not been an affordable replacement since. And as a result, the homeless population has skyrocketed. And so a lot of the homeless population are people who used to stay in boarding houses. And so tiny houses, in terms of different cities, can serve as affordable means for the city to provide replacement boarding houses. And one of the other things as well is that in most cities there are a lot of local charities, Catholic charities and such, who are very passionate about helping the homeless populations, and they have already volunteered or are willing to volunteer real estate to be used specifically for tiny houses to give housing to either the homeless or as replacement boarding houses. And a lot of that's already in place in most cities, and it's just I guess maneuvering through the legal things and forming the right partnerships in order to make that happen. All right, so going back into the demographic of special needs. So in college, I designed a center for autism in one of my architecture studio classes, and in doing that, you learn a great deal about whatever purpose a building will be designed for. If you're designing a dentist's office, you in essence have to become a dentist in order to know all the things that they need, down to very specific things. So the team that I was on, we were able to learn a great deal about autism in general. So one of the things we learned is that for anyone that is deemed, mentally incapable or not competent, these people are disqualified from inheriting homes or real estate from their parents or family. And as they are not mentally qualified to take care or manage the properties. So for parents that have taken care of a child with autism or Down syndrome their entire lives, once the parents get so old that they either pass away or need to be placed in care facilities themselves, then the child they were looking after must also be placed in a facility. So it takes a long time for any given person with these disabilities to become accustomed to a new environment. So tiny houses qualify as private property, not real estate, and as a result of that, it makes it so that people with mental disabilities could inherit a tiny house that they could live in, which is kind of interesting. So if started early enough, parents can place their adult child with mental disabilities in a tiny house so they can keep an eye on them, keep them close, but where they have their own space. And as those parents who are the primary caregivers become older and older, they can slowly wean that child into living in the tiny house so that when the parents can no longer be there, that child has a familiar place where he or she can stay. And so, just in general, there are a great number of demographics that tiny houses can serve, and each one of these demographics comes with its own very specific dynamics, its own specific needs, and challenges. So, moving on to statistics in regards to tiny houses, from the American Community Survey, the average debt still owed on a mortgage in America is $122,000 on average. And so roughly 30% of the population has paid off their mortgages. And statistically, the other 70% generally will never even finish paying off their mortgage by the time that they die. So, said simply, even though our society provides the opportunity for anyone to get a large house with a white picket fence to enjoy for their lifetime, the majority never pay it off. So for the majority, the system really isn't working. It really isn't serving serving the majority of people. So the system allows people to take on more than they can realistically afford to pay off. And in that way, banks don't really have the best interest of people in mind. It's just the way it is. As I mentioned earlier, either by living in a tiny house to save for a conventional house later, or avoiding a conventional house entirely, tiny houses kind of completely change the game. So, unfortunately, banks have no incentive to get behind tiny houses the way they get behind mortgages, because there's no profit in them. A $50,000 business loan, for example, if paid back in 10 years or under 10 years, will only provide a bank between $500 to a few $1,000s depending on the interest. And so, and if paid off really rapidly, then it can be remarkably low. So in regards to tiny houses, the paperwork that has to be done for such a minimal amount of profit isn't worth the bank's time to invest at all. So if anything, tiny houses are taking profit away from banks, as people who normally would be taking out mortgages no longer need to do so. So currently, the way it stands, there is no way to finance building a tiny house the way that people can typically finance building a conventional house. There aren't any large national banks who have set up a system that benefits them in such a way that it's worth their time, but also makes it so people can afford tiny houses. It just hasn't been done yet. There are not any banks that have set up a system that caters to tiny houses. So currently, the only way to finance a tiny house is out of pocket, really. And so, as tiny houses are generally a tenth of the size of a conventional house, home repairs cost a tenth of what is normal. If a new roof normally costs $15,000, it only costs $1,500 to replace a tiny house roof. So, not many people have $15,000 to spare when it comes time to fix their roof, and that's what home equity loans are for, and which just put people more in debt just to keep their house in repair. But just about anyone can afford $1,500 and can save up $1,500 in a few months. And so in that way, tiny houses really change the game as far as what people can afford as well. So I'm going to cover some lessons learned from the collaborative tiny house and the project that we did there. So my sister purchased a tiny house shell from a local school, and I helped her finish it in as well as with several others in our family and also in our community. So I'll be showing some footage that shows it off and shows the completed tiny house. So we learned that when it comes to RV codes, building codes, and zoning, tiny houses are the underdog. It is not legal to live in an RV full time. As RVs by nature are nomadic, it is almost impossible for the government to regulate or enforce this law. So even though it isn't legal to live in an RV over 6 months, that's the law, even though it really isn't enforced heavily at this moment. So all of us know at least someone who lives in an RV full time. Most RV parks only allow an RV to stay for 6 months at a time as a way of enforcing this law. But then you have tiny houses come along. So they are also nomadic in nature, but they are built in such a way that it is obvious that people intend to live in them longer than 6 months. So what do we do with these things? Do we put them in with RVs? Do we put them with normal framing? And as of right now, tiny houses still need their own category. This is my opinion. As they really don't fit any of the existing categories, RVs, for example, have no structural or insulation regulations at all. Like, you can build it out of sticks. It's pretty ridiculous. And so whereas tiny houses are framed with conventional stick framing, which makes them entirely structural and incredibly sound, and they're insulated really well, just like a normal house is. So, in my opinion, as of right now, tiny houses still need their own category, as they really don't fit any of the other existing categories. What has happened is that tiny houses have been funneled into the RV category, even though it really doesn't fit it very well. The only way that you can use a tiny house, the way that you can use a normal house when it comes to living in it yourself or renting it out and basically using it however you would want to because you own it, the only way you can have that type of freedom is if you get it certified as an RV by a certified RV manufacturer. I added up all the fees involved with starting a commercial RV company so that you could become a certified manufacturer, and just in fees alone, basically for setting up different licenses and different inspections for things coming up, it came to roughly $6,000 in Washington State. And so apart from these fees, you must also have a brick and mortar manufacturing facility that you'd also have to pay for. And this facility would have to meet OSHA standards, and you have to have a manufacturing assembly line plan and manufacturing procedure, and it has to be posted in plain sight. And there are a lot of other regulations and different things that are required by the government, such as routine and random safety inspections by labor and industries. And so, basically, said simply, by placing tiny houses in the RV category, it has disqualified tiny houses from the do-it-yourself market. And so, if do-it-yourselfers build a tiny house, it is nearly impossible to make it a legal vehicle or structure. And so, if you build a tiny house that you build it yourself and it's a do-it-yourself vehicle, in almost every state in the country right now, it will be an illegal vehicle and structure, and you will be living in it illegally or using it illegally. That's just the way that it stands right now. So, and most people can't afford to set up they don't have the time to fill out all of these $6,000 worth of fees and regulations and their own manufacturing facility. And so, really, it really disqualifies it from the do-it-yourself market, which is really sad. And so, in my opinion, placing tiny houses in the RV category is a mistake, and it needs to be changed. So, As it stands right now, people are living in and traveling the country in tiny houses, and the government is not cracking down on them the same that they aren't cracking down on the thousands or millions who are living in RVs full time. And so it's just kind of this, what do we do? Do we change this law? We can't change this law because it's a precedent, and so there's a lot of it's just kind of up in the air right now. Kind of, I guess said simply, tiny houses just messed up everything as far as the current system in place. So, in my opinion, the best thing that could happen with tiny houses, from the experience in helping my sister finish hers and learning everything about all these legal hurdles that you have to cross that are very unique, just specifically to tiny houses. It is easier to build a conventional size house, far easier to do that than it is to build a tiny house when it comes to the legal hurdles. So, in my opinion, the best thing that could happen with tiny houses is if a new category of housing was created and defined specifically just for tiny houses. And I think that it should be called something like mobile accessory dwelling units. If placed on a trailer, the trailer would first have to be inspected by the Department of Licensing or respective state patrol to verify that the trailer is roadworthy, and from there, the construction side of things needs to be handled by local building inspectors and treated just as if it is a new construction home, and follow building codes for the International Residential Code, the IRC. And once completed, the tiny house would then have to go back to the Department of Licensing a second time to verify that the tiny house is within the weight capacity standards of the trailer and tongue of the trailer, and that the trailer is roadworthy. So that's what I think needs to happen. I think that would be the best thing in order for tiny houses to really get some serious traction, as if something along those lines occurred. So right now, every state and every county inside the state treats tiny houses differently. Some welcome tiny houses with welcome arms. Others make it impossible to have them and are downright hostile towards them. So, for example, Oregon and several counties in Oregon are extremely friendly to tiny houses, whereas Washington, just above Oregon, is really hostile, especially in the Seattle area. Most of all those areas have gone to extreme measures to make sure that tiny houses are impossible to build legally. So before you start building a tiny house for yourself, you need to realize that you need to dig really deep into your local community to find out what the local codes and zoning are, so you can see if it is even legal for you to build yourself a tiny house. It sounds ridiculous that it may not be legal for you to build something on your own property, but that's the way it is. If you build a tiny house for yourself, in most cases, the only way you will be able to live in it is if you also have a conventional size house also. The reason for this is that decades ago, maybe even a long time ago, I honestly haven't looked into when these laws were originally made, but it was a long time ago. So whenever residential building codes were being established, the government came up with a number of 600 square feet as the minimum size of a house that can be built in any given county. Why? Because they charge a certain amount in taxes per square feet for property. And anything below 600 square feet didn't provide enough income from taxes to support the local bureaucracy in order to manage the affairs of the county. In addition to that, at the time, whoever wrote these laws probably never imagined that people would want to live in anything less than 600 square feet. So they didn't think it would be a problem, obviously. So again, tiny houses turn that idea on its head. They come along, and because they are under 600 square feet in most cases, almost all tiny houses are under 600 square feet, they don't meet the minimum requirements to support the local bureaucracy. So that's another thing that's against them. So in my opinion, if the verbiage were changed to 600 square feet or less, rather than a minimum of 600 square feet, that people with tiny houses would be obliged to pay taxes for a 600 square feet home, even if their tiny house